Subscribe to my YouTube channel, share it with your friends, and comment your thoughts. It was a late afternoon when Alexander Blackwood, a self-made millionaire, walked into the upscale restaurant, his confidence radiating through the thick walls of glass and marble. The luxurious hum of the dinner crowd surrounded him, but his mind was elsewhere, on the bet he had made just days ago. A bet that had already begun to haunt him. Across from him sat Marissa Hale, the woman who would become the subject of his wager, whether she knew it or not. Her gaze was steady, unbothered by the subtle murmurs of others in the room. Marissa, an obese woman, known for her intelligence and wit, was a far cry from the women Alexander typically surrounded himself with. And that was the challenge. The bet wasn't about her, it was about proving something to his closest friends, to those who had mocked him for never stepping out of his comfort zone. "You're sure about this?" Marissa's voice broke through his thoughts, and her eyes met his, sharp and knowing. Alexander smiled, a mixture of arrogance and curiosity playing in his expression. A challenge is always more interesting when it's unexpected. But the truth was, Alexander had no idea what he had gotten himself into. He had always been in control, his life, his wealth, his choices. He'd never dealt with someone like Marissa. Not someone who seemed immune to the games he was used to playing. As he sat there, watching her, a part of him began to question his decision. He had promised his friends that he would win the bet, that within a year, he would have married Marissa, making her the perfect accessory in his life of success and luxury. He never expected that she might bring something to the table that would shatter everything he thought he knew about relationships, about people, and about himself. The bet was simple: marry her, and they would both walk away richer than they had ever dreamed. But there was one thing no one had counted on: Marissa wasn't playing by the same rules. The night before, Alexander had been at one of his usual high-profile gatherings. His friends had been discussing everything from new business ventures to the latest in luxury cars, but there was one conversation that had caught his attention. It had been a passing remark, something his best friend Jason had said casually: "You know, Alex, you're all about control, but I've never seen you take a real risk. You're all talk when it comes to relationships." The word stung, more than Alexander had expected. He prided himself on being the one who always stayed ahead, calculated every move. But relationships? He wasn't interested in those, he had too much to focus on. But when Jason had suggested he take on the challenge of marrying someone unexpected, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to prove everyone wrong. When Alexander heard about Marissa Hale, it was through one of his connections. She was an enigma, intelligent, strong-willed, and yes, overweight, but none of that bothered Alexander. If anything, it made the challenge more enticing. Jason had laughed when Alexander mentioned her name. "That'll be an easy win. A woman like that won't stand a chance against you." Marissa's reputation wasn't as glamorous as Alexander's, but she had made a name for herself. A popular author, an activist, and a regular speaker at various women's empowerment events, she had created a life for herself that demanded respect. But there was something else about her that made her different from the others. She didn't seek Alexander's attention. She didn't seem to care about his wealth or status. And that, more than anything, intrigued him. Alexander had always been surrounded by women who admired him for his wealth, his power. Women who played by his rules. But Marissa wasn't like them, and that's what made her the perfect target for his bet. As the days passed, the tension between them grew. The initial meetings, filled with polite conversation and small talk, began to evolve into something more. There was something in her eyes, something that made Alexander feel like he had never truly known control before. And for the first time in a long while, he found himself questioning if he was actually the one being tested. Marissa was far from impressed with Alexander's charm. She had heard the rumors about him, how he was known for making his millions off the backs of others, how he was notorious for betting on everything, from business deals to people's lives. She didn't care about his money, and she didn't care about the luxury cars or the yachts. To her, they were nothing more than empty distractions. But when the bet was proposed, Marissa didn't immediately turn him down. There was something about the way Alexander spoke to her, something in his eyes that made her wonder if he was as ruthless as everyone said he was. She wasn't intimidated by him, but she was curious. She had been asked out by plenty of men, rich and poor, charming and arrogant, but this was different. There was a strange kind of power in being the subject of a bet, in having someone treat her as nothing more than a challenge to win. But for Marissa, it wasn't just about taking a stand. It was about understanding why someone like Alexander, with all his wealth, would even be interested in her. So, she agreed. The first few weeks were uncomfortable. Alexander tried to play the part of the perfect gentleman, taking her out to lavish dinners, buying her expensive gifts, but Marissa remained detached. She didn't want the material things he was offering. She wanted something real, something beyond the surface. But Alexander was too focused on winning to notice. He was too used to people doing what he wanted without question. He hadn't expected Marissa to question him, to challenge him at every turn. He had assumed that, like every other woman, she would be flattered by his attention. But instead, she treated him like a puzzle to solve, and that made him nervous. Every dinner, every conversation felt like he was losing ground. And for the first time in his life, he felt out of control. Marissa had no intention of making things easy for him. She had been through her fair share of heartbreak and disappointment, and she wasn't about to let someone like Alexander Blackwood waltz into her life without proving he was worthy. She had no interest in his money or his status. All she wanted was honesty and respect. The more Alexander tried to charm her, the more distant she became. But it wasn't just her distance that troubled him, it was the way she began to unravel his assumptions about relationships. She wasn't looking for perfection, and she wasn't looking for validation. She simply wanted something real, something that came from the heart. But Alexander didn't realize that until it was too late. One evening, during one of their regular dinners, Alexander saw something in Marissa he hadn't expected. She was talking about a project she had been working on, a book about resilience and overcoming the odds. Her passion was evident, her words powerful, and for the first time, Alexander didn't feel superior. He felt small. As she spoke, her eyes lit up with excitement, and he realized that he had been so focused on the bet that he hadn't taken the time to truly listen to her. He had been chasing an idea of her, an idea that was nothing more than a shallow image of what he wanted. But this woman, sitting across from him, was more than a challenge. She was a force, and Alexander had underestimated her. The realization hit him like a brick. This wasn't about winning anymore. It wasn't about proving his worth. It was about something far more complicated, something he had never anticipated. It was about real feelings. And that scared him. As the evening drew to a close, Alexander found himself walking her to the door of her apartment, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. He wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he simply stood there, watching her walk away, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if he was the one in control anymore. Days turned into weeks, and Alexander felt himself spiraling into a world he had never expected to find himself in. The bet, which had seemed like a simple game of dominance and control, had begun to feel more like an intricate puzzle, one he couldn't quite solve. Every time he thought he had Marissa figured out, she surprised him. Her emotional walls were more like fortresses, and no amount of his charm, wealth, or calculated moves could break them down. He had always prided himself on knowing how people tick, how to manipulate situations in his favor. But Marissa wasn't interested in the games he played. She wasn't impressed by his wealth, and she wasn't swayed by the luxury that followed him everywhere he went. Instead, she challenged him at every turn, questioning his motives and forcing him to look at himself in ways he never had before. It had been 3 weeks since the dinner at the upscale restaurant, and Alexander was beginning to feel the weight of his decision. He had tried to keep things light, to play the role of the wealthy businessman who could have anything he wanted. But with every conversation, with every look from Marissa, he found himself more and more entangled in something he couldn't control. Marissa, on the other hand, had begun to see through the facade. She had been around people like Alexander before, people who thought they could buy their way into anyone's heart, people who thought their status and money made them untouchable. But she wasn't like them. She didn't care for the flashy dinners, the expensive gifts, or the designer clothes. What she wanted was something genuine, something real. It had started innocently enough. At first, she had played along with the idea of the bet, not fully understanding the depths of Alexander's intentions. But as she got to know him, as she saw the layers of insecurity hidden beneath his confident exterior, she began to wonder if she was part of something much larger than herself. Something that could either break or make them both. Marissa had always been the type of woman who found comfort in solitude. After years of struggling with her weight, with the criticisms and the judgment of others, she had learned to rely on herself. But Alexander was different. There was something about the way he looked at her, something that made her question everything she had ever known about love, trust, and self-worth. She was used to being judged for her size, but Alexander didn't seem to care about that. What he seemed to care about was winning. And that was a game she wasn't willing to play. It was late one night when the turning point came. Alexander had invited Marissa to a lavish event at one of his most exclusive properties, a mansion perched high on a hill, overlooking the twinkling lights of the city below. He had gone all out, planning every detail meticulously, hoping to impress her, hoping to win her over with his charm. But what he didn't expect was the moment she stepped into the room. Marissa had always been confident in her own skin, but tonight, she felt a slight unease. The opulence of the mansion, the perfection of the night, everything screamed of a world that she didn't belong to. She had agreed to come, hoping to see a different side of Alexander, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was merely a pawn in his game. A bet to be won, a challenge to be conquered. As she entered the grand ballroom, she saw him standing by the window, looking out at the city lights. His posture was perfect, as always, his suit sharp, his jaw clenched in thought. For a moment, she hesitated. There was something about him that made her want to believe. He was more than the sum of his wealth, more than just the arrogant businessman who had made a bet on her life. "Alexander," she called, her voice cutting through the quiet hum of the room. He turned to face her, a brief smile crossing his lips. But there was something in his eyes that made her pause. He wasn't smiling with his eyes. "Marissa," he said, his voice smooth but lacking the usual confidence. "I'm glad you could make it tonight." She walked over to him, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "It's quite a night," she said, glancing around at the grandeur of the room. Alexander chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "You haven't seen anything yet. This is just the beginning." For a moment, Marissa wanted to ask him about the bet. She wanted to confront him, to ask if he was doing this for her or for himself. But something stopped her. Instead, she simply nodded, her eyes flicking over the guests who were beginning to fill the room. "Why don't you come with me?" Alexander asked, his voice softer now. He led her to the center of the room, where a grand piano stood beneath a chandelier. He reached out and gently placed his hand on her back, guiding her to the piano bench. Marissa froze at the touch. For a moment, it felt as though the whole room had gone silent. The guests had begun to gather around, and all eyes were on them. She knew what he was trying to do. He was trying to make her feel special, to make her feel like she was the center of attention. But in that moment, she felt like an exhibit, a showpiece for his guests to admire. She sat down at the piano, her fingers resting on the keys, the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest. She glanced up at Alexander, who was watching her with an unreadable expression. "Go ahead," he urged. "Play something. Show them what you're really made of." The words stung more than she expected. They weren't just about the piano. They were about her, about what he thought of her, about the role he wanted her to play in his life. She was supposed to be the trophy, the woman who had been won. But in that moment, something inside her snapped. She stood up from the bench, pushing past him. "I don't need to prove anything to anyone," she said, her voice low but fierce. "Not to you, and not to your guests." The room fell silent. Alexander stood there, shocked by her sudden outburst. Marissa turned and walked toward the door, her heels clicking against the floor with each determined step. As she left the mansion, she could feel the eyes of the guests on her back, but it didn't matter anymore. She wasn't playing his game. She wasn't a part of his bet. Alexander stood alone in the ballroom, the sounds of the guests around him now fading into the background. He could hear his own heartbeat, loud and erratic in his chest. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he had lost control. Marissa had walked away, and it wasn't just her leaving. That troubled him, it was the way he felt about it. He had expected her to fall in line, to be impressed by his wealth, his power. But instead, she had shown him that it wasn't about any of that. It was about something far more important, something he had never understood until now: respect. The night was far from over, but Alexander's world had already begun to unravel. Alexander sat alone in the darkened ballroom, the shadows cast by the chandeliers stretching across the room like long fingers. The guests had left, the laughter and chatter replaced by an eerie silence that weighed heavily on his chest. He stared at the door through which Marissa had exited just hours earlier. The evening had started so perfectly, yet it had unraveled in ways he hadn't expected. Marissa Hale, the woman he had bet on, had left him standing there, humiliated in front of his peers. And yet, something inside him shifted. What was it about her that unsettled him so much? She was supposed to be part of the game, a challenge to win, nothing more. But now, as he sat in the empty room, he realized that he wasn't just chasing the bet anymore, he was chasing her. The next few days were a blur. Alexander went through the motions of his life, attending meetings, making calls, closing deals, but his mind was elsewhere. Every thought, every moment, led back to Marissa. He couldn't shake her from his mind. What had happened that night? Why had she walked away? He had no answers, and it frustrated him more than he cared to admit. He tried calling her several times, but she didn't answer. Her voicemail was filled with generic messages that he had no interest in listening to. He had never been the type of person to chase after anyone. People usually came to him, whether they were business associates, friends, or women looking for a piece of his world. But this was different. Marissa wasn't playing by the same rules. For the first time, Alexander found himself questioning everything he had believed about relationships. They had always been transactions for him. Women were either partners, competitors, or stepping stones in his path to greater success. But Marissa was neither of those things. She didn't want his money. She didn't want his power. She didn't care about his reputation. She wanted something real, something that wasn't dictated by wealth or status. It was 2 days later when Alexander finally got the message. It was short, direct, and left him feeling unsettled. "I'm not interested in playing your games, Alexander. This is over. Don't contact me again." The words hit him harder than he expected. He had been prepared for rejection, of course, he wasn't naive, but this felt different. This was more than just her walking away from the bet. This was her telling him, in no uncertain terms, that she was done. That she didn't need him, didn't want him. And that made Alexander feel something he rarely felt: powerless. The next morning, as he sat in his penthouse, staring out over the city skyline, he found himself at a crossroads. He could let it go, forget about Marissa, move on with his life, and focus on the next big deal. After all, he had plenty of other things to occupy his time. But something inside him pushed back against that idea. What was it about Marissa that made him feel so uncertain? He had never been the type to chase after anyone. He had always been the one to decide when things ended, not the other way around. And yet, here he was, wanting to fix something that wasn't broken, trying to salvage something that wasn't his to control. But that was the challenge, wasn't it? Marissa wasn't like anyone he had ever known. She didn't care about his wealth, his connections, or his reputation. And that made her more valuable than anything he had ever owned. In the days that followed, Alexander found himself grappling with the realization that he had been wrong all along. He had approached this bet with the mindset of a businessman, calculating, controlled, strategic, but Marissa had forced him to confront something he had been avoiding for years: vulnerability. And that was the hardest thing to admit. He decided to take a different approach. He wasn't going to call her again. He wasn't going to send her flowers or expensive gifts, trying to win her over like a typical businessman would. He was going to show her something real, something he hadn't shown anyone in a long time. He wasn't sure what that would look like yet, but he was going to find out. Meanwhile, Marissa had her own battles to face. She had walked away from Alexander because she knew he wasn't the man she wanted in her life. She had never been the type to settle for anything less than genuine connection, and Alexander represented everything she had fought against in her life. Her past had been filled with too many false promises and people who saw her as nothing more than a project to fix. She had spent years learning to love herself, to accept who she was, no matter what others thought. And yet, Alexander had made her question everything. She had thought she could handle him, that she could play the game and walk away unscathed. But the truth was, she had underestimated herself. She had allowed herself to care, to get caught up in the attention he gave her. And now, she was left feeling vulnerable. But Marissa wasn't about to fall into the same trap again. She had too much to lose. It was several weeks before they crossed paths again. Alexander had been careful. He hadn't contacted her, hadn't pushed her, and had focused on his business while trying to understand what had gone wrong. He knew Marissa was still in his thoughts, but he also knew that he couldn't make her care. He had to show her that he was more than just the man who made bets on people's lives. The encounter happened unexpectedly. Alexander was at an event, speaking at a conference for young entrepreneurs, when he saw her, standing at the back of the room, watching him. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, he forgot what he was supposed to be saying. All his attention shifted to her. Marissa noticed him, too. Their eyes locked across the room, and for a brief second, it felt like everything had fallen into place. But then, just as quickly as the connection had been made, she turned and walked out of the room. Alexander hesitated for only a moment before following her outside. The cool evening air hit him as he stepped into the courtyard, and he spotted her standing near a fountain, looking out into the distance. She hadn't noticed him yet. "Marissa," he said softly, stepping toward her. She turned, her face unreadable. "What do you want, Alexander?" He hesitated, trying to find the right words. "I want to talk. About everything." Her gaze softened slightly, but she still stood her ground. "There's nothing to talk about. You made your bet, and I walked away. That's the end of it." He shook his head. "It's not the end. I know I messed up, but I'm not here to make excuses. I just want a chance to show you that I can be more than the person I've been." Marissa was silent for a long moment, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to gauge his sincerity. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "I don't know if I can trust you, Alexander. You've played this game with me from the start, and I'm not sure I want to be part of it anymore." He stepped closer, but still kept a respectful distance. "I'm not asking you to trust me right now. But I'm asking you to give me a chance to prove that I can be someone worth trusting." She looked at him for a long time, the weight of his words hanging between them. "Why should I?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with uncertainty. "Because," he said, his tone low and steady, "I'm not the man I was when we first met. And I don't want to be the man I used to be anymore. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of emotions for both Alexander and Marissa. The fragile bridge that had begun to form between them after their brief confrontation in the courtyard seemed to hover just above the surface of their lives, always at risk of crumbling under the weight of their pasts. Alexander found himself trying harder than ever, but it wasn't just about winning Marissa over anymore, it was about understanding her. It was about understanding the reasons behind her walls, the reasons she had walked away. He had tried to conquer her once, to treat her like a game to be won, but now, he saw her as something far more precious, something he couldn't afford to lose. And yet, no matter how hard he tried to prove his sincerity, the distance between them seemed to grow. Marissa had no interest in being swayed by grand gestures. She had been down that road before, with promises of change and reform, only to end up disappointed. What she needed from him was not his wealth, not his power, but the one thing he had never been able to give anyone: authenticity. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when the phone call came. Alexander had just finished a meeting and was sitting in his office, going over the details of a new business proposal, when his phone buzzed. The name on the screen made his heart skip a beat. Marissa Hale. For a moment, he hesitated. He had learned the hard way that rushing to answer her calls had never worked in his favor. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't the one who needed to chase. This time, he had to be patient. He answered the phone, his voice calm but with a hint of uncertainty. "Marissa." "Alexander," she replied, her voice soft, almost distant. "I need to talk to you. In person." His pulse quickened. "Of course. When and where?" "Tonight. 8 o'clock. The usual place." The usual place was a small cafe tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, a place neither of them had visited since their first meeting. It was a neutral ground, where neither of them felt the pressure of their worlds colliding. Alexander's mind raced with possibilities, but he pushed them aside. This wasn't about speculation, it was about being present for whatever she needed to say. That evening, Alexander arrived early, pacing outside the cafe, his nerves growing with each passing minute. He had no idea what to expect. Was she finally ready to let go of the past? Or was this another confrontation, another moment where he had to face the reality of his mistakes? When Marissa arrived, she looked different. Her usual confidence was still present, but there was something more in her eyes, something fragile. She was wearing a simple black jacket, her hair loosely tied back, and there was a quiet grace in the way she moved. "Hi," she greeted him, her voice a little softer than usual. "Hey," Alexander replied, his own voice surprisingly shaky. "Thanks for agreeing to meet me." They sat down at their usual table, the place they had shared their first real conversation, a moment when neither of them knew where things would lead. "I've been thinking a lot," Marissa began, staring down at her hands as they rested on the table. "About everything. About the bet, about you, about us." Alexander's breath caught in his chest. He wasn't sure if he was ready to hear what she had to say, but he knew it was necessary. "I know you probably think this whole thing has been about winning for me," she continued. "And I get it. I really do. You didn't come into this with the best intentions. But I've realized something, too." She looked up at him then, her gaze steady but full of emotion. "I'm not the same person I was when we met. I've spent so much time protecting myself from people who only wanted to use me, to change me. But I've also realized that I've been doing the same thing with you." Alexander felt the weight of her words. For the first time, he understood that this wasn't just about the bet. It was about trust. It was about vulnerability. And it was about allowing themselves to truly see each other, without the masks they had worn for so long. For the next hour, they talked. Not about the bet, not about their pasts, but about who they were, about their fears and desires, about the things they had never shared with anyone else. Marissa spoke about her childhood, the challenges she had faced growing up in a world that had constantly judged her for her appearance. She spoke about her journey of self-acceptance and how she had learned to embrace her body, despite the harshness of society's standards. Alexander listened, really listened, for the first time in their entire relationship. He had always been so focused on his own world, on what he wanted, that he had never truly taken the time to understand her. But now, as she spoke, he could feel the walls she had built over the years. He could understand the pain she had carried with her for so long. He shared his own story then, the one he had never told anyone. He spoke of his parents, of the pressure to succeed, of the loneliness that had accompanied his rise to the top. He had never been good at showing emotions, never been good at opening up to others. His success had come at a great personal cost, and it had left him with a hole in his heart that no amount of wealth or status could fill. But in this moment, sitting across from Marissa, he realized that he had been missing something all along. He had been so consumed with proving himself to the world that he had forgotten the most important thing, the ability to connect with others. "I've always been afraid," he admitted, his voice quiet. "Afraid of being vulnerable, of letting anyone see the real me. But you've shown me something I didn't know I needed. You've made me realize that there's more to life than winning." Marissa reached across the table, her hand resting gently over his. "We all have our battles, Alexander. But the only way to really win is to let go of the need to control everything. To stop pretending that we're invincible, that we don't need anyone else." As the night wore on, the conversation continued, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they were both present. They weren't worried about the past, or the future, or the mistakes they had made. They were just two people, finding common ground, sharing pieces of their souls. By the time they left the cafe, it was nearly midnight. The city was quiet, the streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. Marissa and Alexander walked side by side, not speaking at first, but feeling the unspoken connection between them. It wasn't about the bet anymore. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about starting over, about finding something real amidst the chaos of their lives. "I'm not asking for you to forgive me right away," Alexander said, breaking the silence. "But I want to prove to you that I'm not the man I was when we first met." Marissa turned to face him, a soft smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I'm not asking for anything, Alexander. But I'm willing to see where this goes. I'm willing to take that chance with you." As they parted ways that night, neither of them knew what the future held. But for the first time in a long while, they both felt like they were moving towards something better. And maybe, just maybe, it was enough. The days that followed their heart-to-heart conversation were a delicate balance of hope and uncertainty. Both Alexander and Marissa found themselves in a strange limbo, caught between the past that had shaped them and the possibility of a future they couldn't quite define. Alexander threw himself into work, trying to keep his mind occupied with deals, mergers, and contracts. But the truth was, his thoughts kept drifting back to Marissa. He had made so many mistakes, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she had been the one person who truly understood him. And that frightened him. For the first time in his life, he wasn't in control, and that made him vulnerable. For Marissa, the days were filled with reflection. She had spent so much time protecting herself from people like Alexander, people who saw her as a challenge to be conquered. And yet, something inside her had shifted. She had seen a side of him that no one else had ever witnessed, his insecurities, his fears, and his desire to change. But change was not an easy thing to embrace. She wasn't sure if she could trust him again, not fully, but she knew that she had to try. The next time they met, it was not in the comforting familiarity of the cafe or the quiet corners of their shared world. This time, it was at an event, a fundraiser for a charity Marissa was deeply involved with. Alexander had been invited as a guest of honor, but he wasn't there to showcase his wealth. He was there for her, even if he didn't fully understand why. The ballroom was packed with influential people, all gathered to raise money for a cause that Marissa had championed for years. It was the kind of event that Alexander usually avoided: too many high-profile faces, too many expectations. But tonight, he found himself standing by her side, watching her speak to the crowd with the same passion that had first drawn him to her. As Marissa stood at the podium, her voice steady and sure, Alexander couldn't help but admire her. She had the kind of confidence he had always wanted but never had the courage to cultivate. She wasn't performing for anyone. She was speaking from the heart, sharing her vision with a room full of strangers who, for the most part, didn't really understand her. But Alexander understood. He understood that this was who she truly was. The woman who didn't need anyone's approval. The woman who had fought for herself, who had fought for others, and who had learned to stand tall in the face of every obstacle life had thrown her way. As the event came to a close, the crowd began to disperse, and Alexander found himself alone with Marissa, standing in the corner of the ballroom. She had finished speaking and now stood quietly, her expression thoughtful, as if processing everything she had just said. "That was incredible," Alexander said softly, stepping toward her. "You were amazing up there." She looked at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Thank you. But it's not about me. It's about the cause." Alexander nodded, but there was something else on his mind. He knew that they had come a long way from where they started, but he still felt that there was something unsaid between them. A gap that neither of them had yet crossed. "You've done so much for people, Marissa," he said, his voice tinged with a mixture of admiration and guilt. "You fought for them, believed in them. But, what about you? What do you want? What do you need?" She looked away, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for something, anything, to focus on other than his question. She had always been the one who put others first, who gave everything to her work, to her friends, to the causes she believed in. But when it came to her own happiness, she had always hesitated. She wasn't sure if she even knew what she wanted anymore. "I want to be able to trust again," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to believe that people can change. That they're not just playing games, that they're not just looking for something to take from me." Alexander felt a pang of guilt in his chest. He had been that person. He had played a game with her, used her as part of a bet. But now, as he stood in front of her, he realized that the stakes were higher than they had ever been. He wasn't just playing for the prize anymore. He was playing for her heart. "I never meant to hurt you, Marissa," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I was selfish, and I treated you like an object to win, but that was wrong. I know I can never undo the damage I've caused, but I want to try to make it right." She met his gaze then, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. She had heard these words before: promises, apologies, empty gestures. But this time, something felt different. Something about the way he spoke, the way he looked at her, made her believe that he was ready to change. And yet, she wasn't sure if she was ready to believe him. "I've been hurt before, Alexander," she said, her voice shaky now. "I've trusted people, and they've let me down. You've let me down. But I'm willing to try again. I'm willing to give you a chance, but you have to prove to me that you're not the man you were before. That you're not just playing a game." The night ended with an awkward silence between them. They didn't talk much after that, neither of them knowing what to say next. The tension between them was palpable, but there was a new understanding. A new agreement between them. They weren't ready to fully trust each other, but they were willing to take the next step, together. Over the next few weeks, their relationship began to shift. Alexander didn't try to rush things anymore. He didn't bombard her with gifts or grand gestures. Instead, he took the time to show her that he was serious about his change. He supported her in her work, helped her with her charity events, and started to listen, not just to her words, but to her needs, her fears, her hopes. And slowly, the walls that had once divided them began to crumble. One evening, as they walked through a quiet park near her apartment, Marissa stopped and turned to face him. The cool evening breeze ruffled her hair, and for a moment, she seemed distant, lost in thought. "Alexander," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About us. And I want you to know that I'm not doing this because I'm trying to fix you. I'm doing this because I believe in the person you're becoming." He reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "And I'm doing this because I believe in the person I can be when I'm with you." She smiled, a genuine smile, the kind he hadn't seen from her in a long time. It wasn't just a smile of acceptance or tolerance. It was a smile of hope. "Maybe we don't have to have all the answers right now," she said, "but for the first time in a long time, I'm willing to believe that we can figure it out together." As they stood there in the quiet of the park, their hands intertwined, neither of them knew what the future would hold. But for the first time, they were both willing to face it, side by side. The past was behind them, and the future was theirs to shape, together. The seasons had shifted since Alexander and Marissa had first crossed paths, both in the literal and figurative sense. The crisp air of early autumn had settled into the city, bringing with it a quiet stillness that mirrored the changes within both of them. Their relationship, which had started with a game and deceit, had transformed into something deeper, more meaningful. But with growth came challenges, and the final test would come when the past re-entered their lives, threatening to undo all they had built. For Alexander, the change had not been easy. He had lived most of his life in control, a puppet master pulling strings in both his personal and professional life. He had manipulated situations, orchestrated outcomes, and played by his own rules. But Marissa had shown him something different, the power of vulnerability, of being real, of letting go of the illusion of control. It wasn't just the apology he had given her that night in the cafe. It was the commitment to change, the realization that being the best in the world wasn't enough if he wasn't true to himself, and to the people around him. Every day, he worked to show her that he wasn't the man he used to be, not the man who had wagered with her life and heart as if they were mere commodities to win. For Marissa, it was no less of a challenge. She had spent so many years building walls to protect herself from disappointment, from heartbreak, from people who only saw her as a means to an end. She had learned to be strong in ways that no one ever saw, the constant fight against judgment, the inner battles to love herself, to accept herself when others could not. But Alexander had cracked that armor in ways she hadn't anticipated. For the first time, she had allowed herself to believe in someone else's sincerity, to believe that someone could care for her, not despite her imperfections but because of them. Their days had begun to blend together, dinners at quiet restaurants, walks through the park where they first confessed their feelings, and evenings spent in companionable silence. But there was an unspoken understanding between them, neither of them had forgotten the past. They couldn't. The scars were there, hidden beneath the surface, but each day they worked to make peace with it. It was one evening, under the fading golden light of dusk, that the shadows of the past returned in full force. Alexander had just come back from an important business meeting, one that had seen him win a significant deal that would further solidify his position in the business world. It should have been a moment of celebration. But as he entered his penthouse, his phone buzzed with a message that made his heart drop. It was from Jason, the one friend who had been there from the beginning. "You need to come to the office. There's something you need to see." He had learned to trust Jason, but he also knew that there were things his friend had yet to forgive him for. It had been years since they had first bet on Marissa, and though they had remained close, there was always an undercurrent of tension. Jason had never fully understood why Alexander had let the bet go as far as it had. Perhaps, in his own way, Jason believed that Alexander should have won her, should have ended up with Marissa as a trophy. But Alexander had made the choice to change, and that had made Jason uncomfortable. Still, the message wasn't just a casual call to hang out. Something was wrong. At the office, Jason's expression was grim, more serious than Alexander had ever seen it. Jason was the kind of man who wore his emotions on his sleeve, and when he spoke, his voice was low, almost reluctant. "I need to show you something, Alex," Jason said, leading him into the conference room. The projector flickered to life, and Alexander watched as an image appeared on the screen, a photo of Marissa. But it wasn't a recent photo. It was a photo of her from months ago, before they had reconnected, before the bet had taken a backseat to their real connection. She was sitting in a cafe with someone else. A man. "Who is this?" Alexander asked, his heart beginning to pound in his chest. Jason didn't answer immediately. He clicked through more images of Marissa with the same man, laughing, smiling, in what looked like very personal moments. Her ex? Alexander whispered, unable to believe what he was seeing. Jason's voice was softer now, more hesitant. "Not exactly. This man has been following her for weeks. We don't know much about him, but we know that he's been in contact with Marissa again. And we think it's more than just casual." The news hit Alexander like a punch to the gut. He had spent so many months trying to prove his worth to Marissa, to show her that he was not the man who had made that horrible bet, that he was someone capable of love, someone capable of being vulnerable. And now, the past was coming back, threatening to undo everything he had worked for. The jealousy burned in his chest, but there was also a gnawing feeling, an overwhelming sense of doubt. Had she truly forgiven him? Or was the man in these photos someone who had never really left her life? "I need to talk to her," Alexander said, his voice shaky with the weight of everything he was feeling. Jason nodded, but he didn't look convinced. "You sure about that? You've been trying to be better. But if you confront her with this, it might be more than she's ready for." "I have to know," Alexander replied, his voice firm. "I can't live with the unknown." It was late in the evening when he arrived at her apartment. He had spent the whole afternoon in turmoil, trying to reason with himself, trying to make sense of everything. Was Marissa still committed to him? Was the bond they had created strong enough to survive this? Marissa opened the door, her expression one of mild surprise. "Alexander. What's wrong?" He stepped inside, his thoughts running wild, his emotions in a state of chaos. "We need to talk." "About what?" she asked, trying to sound casual, but there was an edge to her voice. He took a deep breath. "I saw the pictures." "Who is he, Marissa? Who is the man you've been with?" For a moment, she looked taken aback. Her expression shifted, but only slightly, as though she was trying to process what he was saying. "How did you?" "It doesn't matter how," Alexander interrupted. "What matters is that I want the truth. Is there something you haven't told me? Is there something you're hiding?" She hesitated for a long time, her eyes lowering to the floor. "It's not what you think," she said softly, her voice trembling. "This man, he was someone from my past. He came back into my life when I was confused. Before everything with you, before we started this." Alexander felt a wave of relief wash over him. But that relief was short-lived. "So you were with him after me?" "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No. He came back into my life when we were in a rough spot. But I never chose him over you. I was just scared, Alex. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I could trust you. And I didn't know if I was ready to trust myself again." The weight of her words hung in the air between them. Alexander's chest tightened with the realization that his fear had been unfounded. This wasn't about another man. It was about Marissa's own journey, her struggle to let herself love again. He stepped toward her, his hand reaching out to gently lift her chin. "Marissa, I've never stopped trying to be better for you. But I need you to know. I trust you. And I need you to trust me, too." She looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes. "I do, Alexander. I I wasn't sure if we could be the people we needed to be for each other. I was afraid of what it would take. He smiled softly, his voice quiet. I think we've both been afraid. But that's part of this, isn't it? Trust. And love. We've got to take the leap. As they stood there, in the quiet of her apartment, the future stretched out before them, uncertain but full of promise. The past had been filled with pain, mistakes, and misunderstandings. But it was also filled with the kind of growth that had brought them here. Together. Neither of them knew what the future would hold, but in that moment, they knew one thing for sure. They were no longer playing games. They were ready for something real. Wait for next part. Thank you.